So that was working on just the bottom right quadrant of the full composition for a while, getting the contours in and doing a first pass at some kind of mid-tone on everything. This is the bottom left quadrant of the full illustration, so I focused in on this for a little bit as well to continue doing some testing, making some new discoveries. So let me show you some of the choices I made down in this corner. So here we have the bottom right corner of the image, and you can see the arrangement of my foreground characters versus what will become midground characters. And even with the contours pass, I was trying to establish a clear spatial organization. So you can see the foreground characters have a much more solid and closed line. It's a thicker weight. I went up from a 2% line, which you see back here, to a much more swollen, I think it was a 4% line. So it's literally twice as heavy of a mark, and it brings them forward really, really quickly, which is cool. So here is the first pass of tone that I made, which is basically a match to the other corner that we were working on. So I was using single hatching on pretty much everything. I don't think I get into any cross hatching at this point. So it was more about describing planes and clarifying even further what is sitting in front of what, and kind of getting a start on that atmospheric fade that happens in between spatial layers. So here it is with the darkest pass, and that really brings these foreground characters to the front. So as soon as I went cross-hatching with a more swollen, darker stroke, it just really did a lot of that forward bringing for me. It really brings these people so much more clearly ahead of anyone behind them. What else? There was a couple of moments at this stage that I was really happy with that actually surprised me. The bartender became a really surprising benchmark. I was thrilled with how this bartender turned out. I don't know why this looks so legit to me. It might be the relationship between her heavy contour right up against the background character. Maybe it's that relationship. I don't know. I think there's just such a freshness about how the bartender turned out. I mean, I even like how just the one beer tap is sort of activated in a punchier contrast than the others. It's sort of, maybe it just kind of illustrates the philosophy that I was observing in the references about the artist not necessarily staying true to the realities of shading, but more the organization of what's most important in the scene. So technically these two taps would normally probably get as much treatment as this one, but in the sense that in the spirit of organizing important subject matter, I decided not to do that, and it paid off. I think that really looks nice to me. So the other success that I stumbled upon completely by accident was this guy's back. I thought that was such a nice moment. I don't know why that struck me as so, true to the style that I'm going for, but something about, maybe I've seen this in other examples, but there's something about this, real thick line to define the edge of a really bright, broad shape. It might be something like that. I'm still trying to figure that out. It could even be just how it fades off of that thick line to the next character behind. I really don't know, but yeah, overall, I was really happy with this. And here we have the two different corners. So this is the full foreground spread and midground combined together. And you can see where we left off with our midtones on the right corner, especially in comparison to the further along left corner. So let's turn on the darker strokes that I made here so you can see some of these choices. So again, this really connects all the characters that I wanted in the foreground. It really puts them in the same space and brings them really distinctly ahead of anything behind it. There's such a difference in line weight now, even though they all have the same pass with the 2%, the real skinny line. They just look like they're from two different worlds completely, now that the dark line is so dominant. But I like how the contrast turned out, especially when you go, say, off of the dark strokes of her hair directly to the lighter strokes of the midground characters here. There was some things that changed as I kept adding to the composition. So even from here, a lot of the shading that I decided on for, say, these dark pools of shadow, a lot of those got changed because the size of the figure compared to the environment kept making them smaller and smaller. And so the decision that I made was to, kind of unclutter a lot of these moments of hatching when I got into the big composition. But overall, this feels good, and had I stopped here, I would have been fine. But there was so much more information and size to the room, so I had to keep adjusting and sort of balancing things out. Even at this point, though, this is still maybe the most successful moment of the entire drawing at this point. I was really happy with that. And also, as much as I loved this guy's back, I'd say there was a counterpart to it. I really liked how this back turned out. So it must have something to do with the, really confident size of the stroke that happens against a broad shape like that in the foreground. I'm not totally sure, but I really loved this moment and the other one. And here we've got the full composition, so you can see how much more space was added, and it just kind of made all of these once large and dominant figures a lot smaller. So I had to make some changes that I wasn't expecting. So from a distance, a lot of the choices I was making in the hatching of certain areas, it was just looking a little clumsy and a little overly complex. I ended up coming to this stage where I was basically just erasing out hatchwork to give more highlight to things. I didn't realize how much my hatching was sort of encroaching on that necessary bright highlight that all of the foreground characters should get. So you can see that there's still plenty of pitch black little corners to this that help establish the contrast, but basically when you get in here, I had to open up the highlights on the shirt a lot, and even the hat, that got just basically simplified down. I really liked the hatchwork on the jacket of this guy, so I didn't touch that. But things like our courier's legs, I wiped out all the old hatching and decided I would try a new system, something a little more clean and reduced down. So I went back to just a simple cross hatch. I think there might be a moment or two where there's 3 hatches. I don't know where those would be, but so there was a lot of lessons I had to learn about what role the two sizes of stroke are playing. So the skinny and uniform line, that's the undertone here, I'm learning that needs to act a little bit differently than the darker, more swelling strokes. So one of the theories I tried to employ was, and I guess we'll use maybe the foreground as an example, is to use the skinnier line, the undertone, in a much more dynamic spatial rendering of shade, as in, I'm trying to find an example now. Basically, the theory I wanted to test out, and I guess it sort of works, I haven't really checked it all the way, but is that the skinnier line here, I wanted to do it, space it out dynamically, so as it gets more compressed, that's where it starts to shade itself. And I tried to essentially treat all the undertone that way first, and then go back on top and build on that with the darker stroke. But the darker stroke, I wanted to change it up. I thought if the undertone is spreading out, like you can see here, it's a little more spread here, and it gets more compressed here. If the undertone is doing that, then the overtone has to be doing something else, because every time I tried to do some dynamic spacing on the overhatch, it was getting too messy and complex. So what I ended up deciding on was, let's space out the thinner undertone strokes, and with the overtone strokes, go with a uniform spacing, but just start to lighten the weight. So to me, it seemed to work that when you have the two different tones in concert with each other and doing separate things, it sort of works a little better than both of them trying to do the same thing. I mean, this lighter line, it's sort of a mono line. It does not get much thicker or thinner no matter how hard you're pressing, unlike the other one where it can really swell and it can really thin out depending on pressure. So I had to sort of learn that you got to utilize those characteristics of your two different tones to kind of work with each other. What were some other changes I made? Okay, so as far as hatching, I went with a cleaner hatch on a lot of things like this back leg, and sort of found out that if you can do something in a single hatch, then don't do it in a cross hatch. It just starts to get cluttered so fast. I mean, if I do another project like this, I'm certainly going to remember to kind of restrain myself from overtoning and overhatching, because all the highlights I ended up having to go back in and pull them back out. I had to open this back up, certainly the shoulder, and this whole pair of pants, which was a darker kind of blue jean, I went back and simplified it, and it looked fantastic as just a single, mostly highlight pass of undertone. So I was thrilled with that. I went back and cleaned up the shading on the dog as well. Kept a nice dark shadow on him, but it just looks a little more neat and organized, which, as you know, was the kind of the goal all along. There were some other moments that I changed. Let's see. Brought some more highlight to the back of this woman's shirt. I didn't touch my bartender at all. I kind of just left that there as a touchstone for just the kind of choices. I think what's, now that I'm looking at it, I think what does work about this, maybe it was so successful because there is so much unbroken bright skin tone happening. There's so much highlight on her, and it's unfussed, and maybe that's why it looked so good. And so I came back and just kept kind of applying that to different moments, like the shoulder here. Here's some of that dynamic spacing of the undertone, really spread out here, more compressed at the shadow. That was a lesson that I'm glad I learned eventually, but now that I know it, I would definitely start a new drawing like this with that in mind, of applying two different approaches to the two different hatchings, kind of assigning each one its own function. I remember opening up this hat a little more, kind of taking some line work out. Didn't touch the shirt that much. I think I just cleaned up some of the hatching. Oh, I remember I went with just a single, or a cross hatch down here instead of a messy like triple hatch or whatever the hell it was. So overall, real happy with it. Pumped up the shadows on everybody's feet to really give them some more contrast and to really put them under that foreground spotlight. What else? Then in the midground, I decided to do some more balancing because there's so many people in here, and in an attempt to sort of describe the scope of the room a little more, I basically went to the midground folks that happened right after the foreground, because the midground's rather wide, so we have some figures that are sort of in the front of the midground, and we have some figures that are in the back of the midground. So I went through, and the front of the midground figures, I went through and gave it extra tone. I basically dimmed them down so that I could create more layers of atmospheric perspective. So this couple, which is actually the first couple that we started with as far as tone, I took I keyed them down even more. And I think what that does is it helped separate them as a unit, kind of as a single spatial layer, from couples that are directly next to them. So now, even though these are drawn in the same space and with the same line weight, I can get two different spatial layers out of that. That was I really liked how that turned out. And then suddenly these characters are as dark as these characters, so they kind of unify as one, which is nice. And then our kind of nail-biting figure, he actually ended up turning out great. I'm very happy with him because I gave him he's now more affected by this light, and he has kind of a fall-off from the direct blast of this overhead light. So I was really happy with how this kind of darker top shade happening. I like how that's going. These are still fine, didn't touch them. I think I maybe opened up some of the in-between spaces a little just in the name of, that halo effect. So I probably backed off a little bit of my undertone in certain areas. And then here in the back, I suppose I could have left all of this empty like a lot of our examples, but I think it was maybe too empty. So I decided to give it a single hatch tone. And nothing is bigger than maybe a 1% line. This is basically the thinnest line I could get. And everything is done in that. No dark shadows anywhere. A little bit of a kind of a tile pattern on the ceiling there. The album cover is probably going to have a logo up at the top somewhere. So this whole top half is basically just going to be used as framing for the band's logo. So I didn't fuss too much with that at all because it's likely to just get covered up. Here's a fun trick though, and I've learned this in my kind of storyboarding experience, is you can really make a room feel decorated and sort of populated by doing these really kind of shorthand posters or framed pictures or whatever. What I'll often do when I'm storyboarding to make a room feel like it's not some generic sterile wall is you just kind of add some rectangles in perspective. You sort of put them on the wall, but you don't have to worry about filling them in with anything. That would definitely slow you down, and it would bring those too far forward anyway. So that's a fun trick that I don't know if I saw in the reference material, but I think it works, and I've been doing it for other projects. So it's just something I had in my toolbox and utilized. So this project is coming to a close, and my investigation into the late 19th century, early 20th century illustration style, I suppose I could summarize the discoveries. There's a lot more to learn and to practice, but as far as the basics of it, there's quite a few lessons that I can take away and apply to the next project that I, do in this style. So some of those lessons would be things like, have two different line weights at least. That's a real thin mono line and then a slightly thicker swell line. I would also, on the next project, definitely do all outlines first, probably in the thinner line, and then you can always go over the foreground figures with a thicker contour. But I think the contours first is the way to go, at least for me, so that when I'm toning, you can tone around the layers and you can really start layering the atmosphere and the space by avoiding edges. I think another thing would be to remember that the highlights need to stay very prominent, and for me it was trouble remembering that because my habit was to keep filling everything with tone. So on the next project I would likely maybe start by toning around these big areas of highlight and preserving those and not covering them up. What else? So basically, it's a rule for me would be don't overhatch. I think that would apply to anybody doing that style, is for the sake of cleanliness and contrast control. You would want to keep your highlights big and broad, and then don't overhatch inside those. One of the other lessons that that stuck with me is knowing that you can use your line work to describe form and shade at the same time, and that happened a lot in the fabric and in the hair. So that was a fun trick, and it was a really kind of articulate and kind of pithy way to tone a form, to describe a form, is to do it with line work that not only follows the distortions of the fabric and the general form, but it also kind of illustrates the hard shadows that would happen in these little corners. So that was a cool trick that I definitely saw in the references, and luckily I got a couple moments of those in my drawing. The idea of this kind of top-down focus, no matter what layer I'm working on, I guess we'll say foreground and midground particularly. I suppose the background gets a little too empty for this to apply, but for the foreground and midground figures, it seems like you can really apply this top-down focus where the head and shoulders would get the most treatment, and as you go down the body, it can open up a little. It can get a little looser, a little dimmer, so the contrast will sort of dissolve a little. But I saw that even in the midground figures of some of my references. So that was an interesting little trick that I'll have to remember for this time period. And overall, it's sort of just, the idea of letting the empty space stay empty and kind of letting the imagination fill in the negative space. That is definitely something that was going on in this period that I saw unanimously throughout my references. And it's a little hard depending on your background and your training and your personal preferences, because some of us, I think, maybe have this academic encouragement that to cover every square inch with some kind of tone or some kind of information. But I'm learning, if you want to get this style right, you have to let the light just fill everything, and to not disrupt that. Again, it's just so easy to overhatch and overwork these things and pull it out of that period and into something else. So, and speaking of hatching, hatching is something I've been practicing for many years, even way before I was chasing anything specific, because it's such a cool effect, and it's been around for just so many centuries and so many generations of master artists. So I'm learning the way that these guys, these artists, could be some women there too, would have done it is in a pretty organized way, or at least those are the ones I was responding to, is to have a very systematic approach to the hatching. That loops back to my other rule about having two different line weights there. So again, I'll say my experiment was, somewhat successful in trying to organize my hatching. Basically, the rule I've put for myself was, for the lighter stroke, you do your dynamic spacing to show a gradient, and for your overhatching, the thicker shadows and the darker tone, that one, because the stroke swells so much, you kind of use that to your advantage. You keep the spacing uniform, and you let the tapering line and the swelling line describe the gradient. So the combo of those two, I think, was a success. I'm sure it's not a hard and fast rule. I'm sure there's moments where you could have both of them be dynamically spaced and both of them also be kind of swelling and shrinking to show tone. But overall, I'm thrilled with how this turned out. You can see this on my Instagram, and you'll be able to see it on my website along with my other work, danmacdonaldstudios.com.